Welcome back to the Loud Sound Epicenter podcast. I'm your host, Aaron, and you're watching the season finale of the series. We've gone through the 60s all the way up to the end of the century with the 90s, and we covered a lot of pop culture from the more underreported aspects to offer up a new perspective to all the music they emerged from these new eras. And we've arrived at the 1990s. And where do we even begin? There's a lot of material to go over, most of which should probably be reserved for the past, but for the sake of learning from the past, there are plenty of lessons to learn from this decade alone. And we'll be framing the 1990s as the decade of excess, the decade of decadence, and in a negative way, just to be clear. Shifting through the music industry, television, tabloids, really mass media as a whole, and its negative influence. Because this was a time when they had full authority over the culture, and some of you may have even been presided over by this corporate machine. And if you did, let me know if this review is anywhere near the truth, because I was born at the end of this decade, and so I'm looking back in retrospect, and that has its advantages and disadvantages. So for this show, we'll be dividing the decade into three acts. I was talking to a friend of mine, and he got me thinking about how the 90s is really three decades in one. And we've talked about this in past episodes. Obviously, most decades are not from January 1st to December 31st. There is overlap into the next decade. With the 60s, many argue that the ending of the 60s is around 1974, and the 90s is no exception, with the 80s going up to around the early 90s. And so that's that. And so the fact that the 90s is part of that trend, it'll start to make more sense as the episode goes along. I also want to imagine what your average person must think if he were to summarize the 90s just off the top of his head, because you could frame the decade based around its positive achievements. It's arguably the best decade, you could say, for movies, going back to a sort of 70s style or standards, and centered around crime-driven dramas and more edgy filmmaking. It was a lot different from the 80s. And you have Friends, and you have Seinfeld, and Titanic, the rise of Pixar and animation. So there's enough material like that. I also think about that CNN series, where they go through the decades. I think they're just simply titled the 70s, the 80s. And it's things like The Lion King, and it's Meryl Streep. But I think there's a lot of other stuff going on that slips through the cracks. And you could say it's cynical, you could say it's dramatic to have a pessimistic view of the decade. But like I said earlier, there is a lot of lessons from this decade alone. So we'll get right into it. We will get started like 4 minutes into the video, right? With the early 90s. And I would say this begins around 92 with the emergence of grunge and Nirvana, making it mainstream. The Seattle bands, of course, taking MTV by storm, rallying the youth, getting away from glam metal, getting away from the bright, shiny colors. It's funny, people always mention the laser lights. And the only band I can think of that did that, obviously I wasn't there to be a witness to a lot of the 80s concert showmanship. The only band I can think of is Triumph, and they started in the 70s, and they're not one of the biggest bands out of all the 80s bands. So I like to think that when they say I know it's also an identifiable trait, if you were a grunge band, one characteristic you could zero in on is, yeah, no more bright lights that look like lasers. And so, I just like to think that everyone's bullying Triumph, But it does make sense. We're getting away from the lights and we're getting into the dark. And we're wearing flannel while we're doing it too. But, it's funny because although that was big for about 2 years, around 94, it seemed like the genre had run its course because Nirvana was over. And since they were the biggest band out of that scene and the leading force, at least commercially, it seemed like the genre kind of went away with it as Nirvana broke up. While glam metal seemed to have the problem of being derivative and having too many copycat bands, it seemed like grunge had the opposite problem. There were only a handful of bands that the genre could really say are their representatives as grunge, as a title. And the one genre that was clinging to grunge the most, being post-grunge, they seem to be more successful in the long run, especially by comparison to grunge in the early 90s. And you can even hear the influence of the late 90s and early 2000s to this day on the radio. So alternative seemed to be the real successful genre instead of grunge, is what I'm trying to say. Now, with the mid 90s, this is when, now that we're moving away from grunge, after Nirvana, it seemed like nobody could reach that kind of commercial success. The peak of Nirvana could never be replaced with equally, I don't know what you would say, like an equally type band that could fill that void. And that type of success didn't seem to just reach the level that Nirvana had done around 1992. And most of the bands could not carry the genre or take it back to where it was around 92. And I think this is the story of grunge. By contrast, you look at television and somebody like Jerry Springer, who really played an important role in the 90s as a decade. And you could almost imagine two paths being paved out for Generation X. Now that grunge is gone, which direction is the culture going to go in? Do you salvage the remains of the early 90s and live up to the standards and commercial appeal of Phil Donahue? Or do you go completely off course, completely off road, and become Jerry Springer? And it seemed like with television, they were a real influence on the culture, because you look at where the late 90s ended up, and we'll get to that in a minute. But before it reached that level, it seemed like there were some parts of it beginning to develop by the mid 90s, with TV shows that showed a strong indicator of where the state of pop culture was at that time. Looking at talk shows, there was a clear distinction between the commercial appeal of Regis and Kelly and Oprah and what would become Jerry Springer. But in between then, you had somebody like Phil Donahue who bridged these two worlds together. And starting out, he had a commercial appeal, and maybe Jerry Springer, you could argue. These two people seem to start out with a commercial, somewhat mainstream, buttoned up appeal, and eventually surrendered to the Jerry Springer style of content. And so, and then you have just your standard news coverage during the mid 90s. You have O.J. Simpson, you have Tanya Harding, you have the propping up of celebrity gossip, tabloids, and all of that it just seems like that's what made the late 90s possible, is you have sort of the beginning of this already happening around 95, and maybe as early as 94. But this midway point seems to be it played a role in allowing the culture to get away from discourse. And speaking of discipline, which the 90s seem to have a lack of, it's very ironic looking back to the mid 80s and comparing it to the mid 90s, because around 1985 you had the Senate hearing of the PMRC, and according to journalists and critics, it was beyond the pale to ask metal bands to have a little bit of discipline. And it was easy to criticize Tipper Gore and the Washington Wives, as they were called, for being concerned about where the culture, imagine that, where the culture was going in the 80s was seen as excessive, degenerate. And I think there's a reasonable case to be made that the 90s could have had a little more discipline. And I'm just throwing this out there. I know it's the last thing that metal fans want to hear is discipline and the PMRC in any type of positive or insightful way. But maybe there's something to that. And then by the late 90s, to even begin to tap into the late 90s, probably the best indicator would be WWE, the Attitude Era, which started around 97. Like Phil Donahue, WWE had a commercial appeal. And then it went in the direction of Jerry Springer and that style of things. And soon after, you have Woodstock 99. And really, this whole episode, this whole decade could be summed up with Woodstock 99 alone. Because all the bands, all the genres that I mentioned earlier, nu metal, they were all present at that event. It was the whole scene in one setting, and it reached its limit. Many people have documented what happened, and nothing could represent the decade of Jerry Springer, excess, degeneracy, hedonism, more than that single event. So, that's how I would review the 90s. It's very Spenglerian, what Oswald Spengler said about the year 2000 and how society would begin to decline, the decline of the West. You look at the 90s as a decade, and you can see that he made a lot of good points that were made back in the 1920s. So that's the show, the season finale of looking back at, dot, dot, dot. It's a very catchy title, I know. These are the decades that I spent my high school years and my college years, and I still do in my university years. And it's listening, reading, watching. There's a lot of material to make your way through, and it'll definitely keep you busy. But that's the show. Of course, the show will continue on after this series. I'll be reviewing music, movies. We'll see where the show takes us. And you'll have to stay tuned to see all the new content that will be coming out moving forward. And so I want to hear what your thoughts are about the 90s. I know it was pessimistic. I know, like with the 60s, that was a long time ago. It's a bit of an easier target because it was, it seems like enough time has passed of the 60s to be critical of it. Talking about Altamont and talking about how Woodstock may not have been as good as it did, and maybe the 1970 documentary may have framed it as too much peace and love when there were other things going on. But with the 90s, it's a little bit difficult because you have, Gen X and you have millennials still to this day. And so it's a little bit tough to antagonize a decade that a lot of people can relate to. I was going to show, oh man, I forgot to show those little, what do you call those things? In the early 90s, there were those toys that they would sell. I'm forgetting the name of it. Someone in the comments has to correct me. But anyway, I was going to show that to show you, the two sides of the 90s. Some like to focus on Friends and Seinfeld. But it's like, no, it was O.J. Simpson, it was Tanya Harding, That is the decade. And so let me know what your thoughts are if I'm being too harsh. It seems like I'm always a contrarian. You know how the show is. If you watched any of the episodes, you know how the show is. So I would encourage you, if you have not watched the other episodes of the series, check them out. I would like you guys to be the judge. We went through a lot. It's a lot of decades. And if older viewers probably lived through that time, I'd like to hear what my Generation Z perspective, which is the theme on this show, what it sounds like coming from me, and if it lines up with how you perceived it. And from younger viewers, I would like to see if you took anything away from this series. I know that it was a lot of information. Most of it you probably knew. But with 10 years each, there's a lot of content to sift through. And so I'd like to frame it for kind of like a historian, and just kind of frame it. And like I said, pick up some of the underrated or underreported aspects of the decade. So that was the goal. I hope I achieved that goal. I hope you learned a lot, if that was what you intended this to be. As I said, the show will go on, so stay tuned to see what we do next. And as always, have a great rest of your evening.